Hey, listeners. Welcome to the Product Hunt Weekly podcast. I am excited for today's episode because first we're going to go through some new products that you can't miss. Then we'll be joined by some awesome guests. Linus Lee is the lead at Notion AI and a researcher whose work investigates the future of knowledge representation and creative work aided by machine understanding of language. And to dive into his brain and to help me do that, I will be joined later by Ken Miller, who is a founder and engineer, and he also leads Maker Outreach here at Product Hunt. And also by Rajiv Iyengar, who is the Product Hunt CEO. You might recognize him also from our last couple of podcasts. But right now, I'm here with Aaron O'Leary, and you will recognize him as the lovable, smart-witted Irish co-host from my last episodes.
I wouldn't know if I'd use the word lovable or smart. But hello, everyone.
Not trying to be lovable is what makes you lovable. Aaron, it's sort of that like, I'm here for the sass.
Self-deprecating,
Yeah,
almost.
yeah, exactly. Well, Aaron, you do have a quick update to share. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, so the real reason I haven't been on as much, one of them anyway, is basically I got a new newsletter. Hooray! So I launched a newsletter called Maker Stacks, and it's where I interview makers about their product stacks. So far, I've interviewed Ben Lang, who is a Notion guru and community building expert, and Francesco D'Alessio, who is the face behind Keep Productive, a YouTube channel all about productivity with over 400,000 subscribers. Been super exciting. It does mean I've decided to spend a little less time on the podcast and will be stepping aside as your co-host.
You will still be back. Basically, we'll just have some rotating people in and out, and that means that Aaron will be back to co-host sometimes. I will probably try to make all of my future co-hosts try an Irish accent because I will miss you so much. So, welcome to a new segment we call Catnips. Catnips is where we sniff out 3 fresh launches that you can't miss. I know Aaron is just loving all of these cat puns that I've thrown in here today.
So good.
So it's just a section where we go over 3 products. We will do our best to include apps that are super useful for you here, apps that you just need to know about, like what is the news, what's everybody talking about right now, or we'll also share things like what the big FANG companies are doing right now. So the first one is Letterly, and Letterly is a voice to text app and it's created by a couple indie makers, Anton and Pavel. They co-created this app with linguists. So you record yourself and literally drafts a transcript. You click rewrite, and then you can do a bunch of different things with what you recorded. So from the second I tried something, I actually took some of the podcast script and I just spoke it into the app to see how well it would translate what I shared. And first off, the transcript was really good. There were no grammar or error corrections. In fact, I'm sure that it probably removed a lot of my like vocal tics and vocal errors in grammar. And it just produced a very clean transcript. And then I was able to take that transcript and I tried doing a few things. So, for example, it can take your text and make it 2 times shorter, but it preserves the meaning of that text. It can produce a short summary of it. It could structure it with bullets. You can also do things with it like turn that text into an email, turn it into a thread post. I also tried creating a grocery list. What I was impressed by was the fact that it started to actually create sub bullets under that list. So it organized it for me. I'm a big Apple Notes user, and I just shared the note, and it dropped that text in the grocery list note that I already have as an ongoing list. I wasn't the only one who was impressed by the quality of the transcripts. Commenters on the launch page were asking about this. So one commenter asked how the model is fine tuned to do such a good job on the rewrites. And the maker responded to say, we create text with the help of linguists, perfectly suited for various types of writing. Then we upload these texts to the model for training, resulting in very accurate rewrite options. This is a very simplified explanation, of course. And then he calls out some of the makers that helped with this work. So I'll drop that in the show notes. But yeah, give it a shot. Again, I'm really keen to share products here that people can try out and won't take a ton of uplift to get onboarded.
When it comes to Apple Notes, I live in it. I have thousands of notes in there. And as well as that, I freaking hate voice notes. I hate 2 things. I hate essay texts and I hate voice notes. So this solves both of them for me. So if you want to send me a voice note, fine, put it into this and it can send it to me through text. If you have a very long text, this can summarize it better.
Yeah, that's a great point. Also, I will keep that in mind with the essay long Slack DMs that I sent you. Uh, Noted, letterly, is coming your way.
You get a pass. You get a pass. Yours are
Sure, sure. You have to say that. Moving on to Fixkey. So Fixkey is similar vibes here, but for your desktop, specifically for Mac users. Was described as Grammarly for power users. So I'm a Grammarly user. I know you are too, Aaron. Um,
Yup.
yeah, yeah, I mean, if you're a writer, for me, it's been essential, but really anyone, I feel like in a professional setting. And so Grammarly is great, but I love that this app corrects your text for you instead of just highlighting the mistakes. You download the app and install it, and then after that, you write a sentence, for example, you press the shortcut, which you can customize yourself, and then it just fixes it. I tested it out myself to the point where maybe a couple words were incomprehensible, something I do very often, where people are like, "What did you mean by that?" And it just fixed it. It was able to, recognize the sentence and fix it correctly. Super helpful again, rather than just going word by word and correcting it like you would with Grammarly. I don't know where I would be without Grammarly, but at the
Mm.
same time, this is a really interesting new change for your interface. The maker in the demo also just closed his eyes and started writing. Sometimes I do get held up by text. I'll see my typo and I'll go back and I'll want to correct it. And this sort of just lets you free form just think.
Yeah, I feel that a lot. I always kind of feel like when you're writing and you go back to fix a typo, even if it's like English Grammarly, I still kind of see it almost as like context switching, because
Mhm.
you're breaking a flow, and
Yeah.
it can be hard to kind of get back into that after that. What I hate the most is seeing all the little red lines come up if I'm having like a particularly typo filled day. Also, I like it's software. It works in Slack. It kind of works across the board.
Now that you pointed out, I'm definitely distracted by those red underlines all the time, and, then you wanna sometimes I get distracted too reading it, like, "Wait a minute, was that correction really right?" I'll read the description for, like,
Yeah,
why you should have a comma there, and I'm, like, arguing with Grammarly and whether I should really make that
yeah.
correction.
Oh my god, don't talk to me about commas. I don't know why that app loves commas so much.
Yeah, so yeah, check that out. Similar to Letterly, you can also choose another shortcut, and it'll pull up a drop down menu that'll also give you additional things you can do with the text, so you can put it into bullets. You'll see my slacks coming through now. They'll be clearer, they'll be concise, and you won't have to be like, "What were you asking about?" So one more product for today. Apple released an Apple Sports app, the free app. And it's pretty simple right now. It's got real-time scores, play-by-plays, some high-level game stats. You can personalize it with your favorite teams and leagues. So it was really easy for me to just go in and add a few. For me, Denver, so Nuggets, Avalanche, and then a few LA teams like the Dodgers, from since that's where I'm from. And again, super easy to do. So a lot of users have been saying so far they like the simplicity, but really minimal features on the App Store right now. It only has 3.1 stars with 512 reviews. And I think really what's most important here is what the potential is. Think of this as an MVP. Sports is a multi-billion-dollar industry that tech companies have recently been wanting to get a bite of. So they're challenging all the legacy media companies who have traditionally held lucrative broadcasting rights. This is not the first move from Apple. It's again just the start, as they've been dipping their toes in. They purchased MLB and MLS broadcast rights. In the last year, they've been producing sports documentaries. They had a major deal with Lionel Messi. They're not the only ones. Amazon has picked up rights to a wild card playoff game for the NFL. They've been doing Friday night football. And Google as well won some rights to the NFL games last year and beat out Apple for that. Basically, the tech companies are starting to make a move. You can see that the Apple Sports app could be an app that comes automatically downloaded on your
Mm.
phone, like the Notes app or the Stocks app. And that's incredible distribution for them. Part of the reason that sports is so valuable is because right now it's pretty much the only thing left that brings people together at the same time. We all are watching different things at different times. Live TV events, but especially sports, are the only things left that Americans at least are watching together. The Super Bowl, this last
Mm.
Super Bowl 2024, was the most watched telecast of all time, reaching 123.7 million viewers. What's great about sports that these media companies and tech companies have started to understand is that they don't require a lot of scripting and cast, and they are inherently really entertaining. You don't have to constantly think about the script and how it changes from year to year and all that goes into that. There's always going to be a new game, right? New energy, new something that happens in that game. So even though broadcast rights are expensive to get, sports is just a huge opportunity on this for more revenue and almost even saving revenue compared to other places that they could spend it.
To me, it was a total Mandela effect. I was like, when I saw it on the homepage, I was convinced. I had this app for like years, and then it came with my iPhone. I was like scrambling through the pages, like, what the hell? This was definitely here yesterday.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It's like they're not even just focusing on the live aspect as well. It's like they're like rebuilding this new like culture around sport too. So you have like Netflix with like Drive to Survive, which made Formula One like fastest growing sport like 5 years in a row. As this dramatized version of it, essentially, a behind the scenes reality TV kind of thing. And then there's Apple, they're doing a documentary on it and a movie with Lewis Hamilton producing it, I think. But sports is just a big cash cow, and all the tech companies seem to want to get into it.
They're spending a ton of money here. I like your point too about original content too, like, Netflix or some of these tech companies are just better positioned to make really entertaining original content, perhaps even more than some of like ESPN and the other players who don't have as many resources or teams around creating original entertainment content like that. If you've been following along with us for the past few weeks, you know that we have been interviewing Golden Kitty Award 2023 winners. And today we are joined by Linus Lee of the Notion AI team. Notion won the award for Best AI Features after the launch of Notion AI in 2023 to the public. Linus, we're so glad to have you on today. I mentioned Notion is a community favorite. In fact, if you are tuning in, I'm going to assume you probably know what Notion is, but it is a productivity note-taking tool along with many other use cases. It's won Product of the Day, Product of the Month, been nominated for multiple Golden Kitty Awards, and then clinched the win last year for Best AI Features in a very crowded category. So congrats on the Golden Kitties and just your accomplishment. I think it's well-deserved for your team.
Yes, hello. Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you also for the Golden Kitty Award. I've been with Notion for about a little over a year now, which is also about the time for which Notion has been working on AI in sort of full force. And so the award is, at least for us, a big celebration of that, as well as a kind of a chance to thank the community for interested in what we're doing and being along for the ride as we try to figure out how a tool like Notion can benefit from all of the activities that are happening in the AI space as we see everywhere. About a year ago, Notion had one main kind of pillar of our AI product, which we internally call AI Writer. You can ask for revisions, for summarizing information, for referencing or connecting information across the page. And a lot of people use it for improving and sort of revising their writing as well. The second big moment for AI happened for us around the summer last year when we launched AI Autofill, which was a chance to bring the same kind of writer-like AI experience into Notion databases, which is where a lot of our users keep their more structured information. So you can automatically summarize and pull out kind of key items and so on and so forth with Autofill. And then last November, we officially went into beta with Notion Q&A, which is a way to be able to ask questions about anything in your Notion workspace, and then have AI kind of search through that as if it's read everything in your workspace and give you answers. Before Notion, I spent about a year independently exploring and prototyping ideas in the general space of, the way I describe it to people is like, how can we improve text as an interface? There's a lot of tools that improve the way we interact with text, like all these, the writing tools, including Notion, put a lot of Chrome around the text editor, reading interfaces, but text itself is just still kind of a string of characters on a page. And so maybe there are ways to incrementally improve with things like annotation, automatically summarizing, automatically picking out keywords and reorganizing and restructuring what you see on the page, what, when you look at a chunk of text, what it actually looks like and how you interact with it. And so I spent a lot of 2022 experimenting and researching and reading about that space. And that's how I kind of ended up sliding into Notion as Notion embarked on the AI journey.
As you were incorporating AI into the product, what are some of the biggest use cases you see? Were there any that maybe you're still trying to figure out?
The most surprising thing we have observed about adoption recently is just how much people seem to need Q&A. Maybe you could argue this is a problem that we've all created for ourselves by keeping too much information in Notion workspaces. But a lot of times, especially if you're working in like a massively collaborated environment where there are hundreds of people in your Notion workspace, not only is it hard to know where you put some information, but sometimes you also don't know whether that information exists in a workspace, let alone where it might be. Another example of really surprising use case for me has been revision. Next to summarizing information, using Notion AI to improve people's writing and proofread, I think is like the second or third most often cited use case that I hear about when I talk to users. And it's a mixed bag feedback for me because I think, frankly, our interface for improving writing can be a lot better, allow like spot edits and so on. But it's really encouraging to hear that from like a person who cares a lot about interfaces perspective, it's encouraging to hear that people are not using AI to like generate, churn out writing en masse, but using it to improve their own voice and their own writing. Something that I would say hasn't worked well yet, and something that we're continuing to iterate on, is trying to put AI in places where it's more proactive. So we don't have anything like that yet in production, but it's something that we've prototyped about for the last year in all different places in like our internal version of Notion, whether it's like chiming in when you're in like a common thread if someone asks a question, or trying to be like more proactive in general. And proactivity is like an age-old HCI problem, and it's just finding the right time and trying to figure out with context clues exactly what the user is trying to do. I think it's just a really, really hard problem. But maybe language models allow us to unlock that, and maybe obviously if we solve that, I think that's kind of a different category of interfaces that we enable. And so we continue to noodle away on it, and we'll see what happens.
What's your AI stack? Like what models are you using? Are you training your own models?
The main pieces are, we work with OpenAI and Anthropic for their models and their state-of-the-art inference hosting and scaling. And that means that we don't have to spend a bunch of time figuring out how to scale our own language models to the billions of tokens per day scale. Besides that, for features like Q&A, we work with a company called Pinecone for efficiently being able to search and query information in a semantic space. Besides that, a lot of the tooling that we have on the engineering side are kind of built in-house. And I've ended up talking to a lot of founders building other tools in this space for evaluating models, for visualizing how your product is doing, for product analytics, for training and fine-tuning your own models. But most of the time, even if I think their products are really cool and they're working on the right things, we end up, at least within Notion's engineering team on the AI side, we end up kind of building our own tools. I think a part of that is because we were relatively early on when we started sketching out what our AI systems should look like. And so all of the companies that are working on these things at the same time are like figuring out together as we are also figuring out exactly what the big pieces are and what the right architectures and patterns are. And so by the time they've figured out what they want to build, we've also kind of built up our internal version of like how we monitor and log outputs and so on. And so we've grown together with the rest of the ecosystem. I think at the current stage when things are moving so quickly, having all of the tools in-house also allows us to iterate really quickly. And if we need if we want to try out some different way of evaluating model outputs, for example, we can just fix up our code and ship it and have it the next day and don't have to wait on the rest of the ecosystem to kind of collectively figure it out. So a lot of the rest of the stack is in-house.
What's been your journey to this point, getting into like AI as a discipline? Correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't go like the PhD route. It's always been kind of self-directed.
You're right that I had the best description of my background engineering-wise, probably like a web engineer or product engineer. Prior to Notion, I've mostly worked on kind of web front-end with technologies like React and TypeScript and so on. I have always had an interest in lots of other things on the side. So I worked on a bunch of side projects, going from like, I had a phase with programming languages and compilers. So I would build these like toy programming languages. I had a long phase, like I guess a continuing phase with productivity tools. And so I'd build a lot of these things. And then once I started my exploration year that I spent thinking about how to improve text, a lot of the way I end up learning these technologies is just kind of picking them up as I really, really need it. And so when I started working on compilers, one of the things you really care a lot about when you're writing your own programming language is like performance. And so that was kind of my motivation to dive into lower level programming languages. And then when I started looking into improving text interfaces, one of the core building blocks that you really need to understand is NLP. And so I was pretty lazy about it in the beginning, where I looked at the whole kind of deep learning world and I was like, oh, that sounds really complicated. I don't really know much about that. So I'm going to go towards the easy solutions of more classic NLP techniques like TF-IDF and extractive summarization to highlight and summarize content and so on. But then eventually you hit the capability wall through these more traditional techniques. And so little by little, I ended up picking up the pieces that I needed to build the kind of prototypes that I wanted. And so a lot of what helped during that time was open source libraries like Hugging Face. You can go in and just read the code for how they work, right? And so instead of reading papers, which in the beginning I had a hard time doing because I didn't have the academic context to understand everything, I would have like paper up on one side of the screen and then look at the like PyTorch implementation on GitHub on the other side, or I would even maybe like download the library and poke inside and put little print statements here and there to figure out exactly what was happening. And being able to look at actual numbers flowing through the system helped a lot. And so that I picked up sort of little by little as I needed the pieces to incorporate into my prototyping and building, and then eventually catch up to sort of where the frontier is.
It seems that you've got a particular yen for that boundary layer between the human and the machine, like, and the whole variety of ways that we do that. What do you think is the biggest opportunity for us as a human race to advance that? Like, what is open to us now that wasn't open to us 5 years ago?
Grandiose question. The main thing that's new with language models in the last 5 years is that it opens up a chance for the way that knowledge is stored and processed to not be just a sequence of characters or sequence of words, but actually something that's a little bit higher level. So one way to think about, a common way to think about Notion is as a knowledge base, right? But traditionally, without language models, you would have to interact with that as if it's like a sequence of numbers. If you're searching for something, you're looking for things that kind of resemble the span of text that you're searching for, or if you're organizing information, you have to impose your own hierarchy. But with language models, you can treat the knowledge, and this is like the key insight behind Q&A, right? Is you can treat the knowledge as if it's just kind of a blob of information that the system, quote unquote, knows. And then you can sort of imagine asking it a question and pulling out the right information at the right time, or potentially even in the future, telling it kind of what you want to do and having like a perfect document synthesized for it. So instead of having to go traverse like 10 different files to figure out exactly what you need to accomplish some task or like review some information, you can just say, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. And maybe it'll be able to give you kind of a just-in-time compiled document. And so being able to work with information at a higher level, more semantic level, I think opens up a whole universe of possibilities. And we're just obviously exploring the beginnings of that.
I find it really fascinating that we've had a breakthrough in the creative brainstorming part of the thought process more than we've had one in the like fact checking and getting the details right. It's not as good at coming up with like a big stream of text that is actually interesting, right? It tends, when it's writing long form, to end up being a little generic. How do you think about pushing it into, I mean, I hate to say like original thought, but like into something that is more synthetic and less kind of a recitation?
Yeah, I think a part of this is a machine learning problem and a part of this is an interface problem. So a naive way to train an image generator model might be have a database of images and have some model that predicts every pixel in a row or all together, and train the model to minimize the kind of distance between every pixel that it predicts what color it is, and the distance from that color to the color of the true image. This is kind of the way that you do it with text, and so it makes sense that you would want to do it with images. What happens when you do this in practice is the model learns to produce blurry blobs. And this happens because the model isn't actually learning to produce like realistic, interesting images per se. It's learning to minimize the distance between the image that it produces and all of the possible images that it should have produced. And so the way for the model to minimize that distance is to like output grayness, like grainy grayness or blurry grayness that is like roughly in the silhouette of whatever you asked for, instead of like one specific interesting cat or interesting bus or something. There are a bunch of ways to fight this in computer vision. One technique that I think is still quite popular is perceptual loss, where you incentivize the model to not only minimize the distance between the real image and what it outputs, but also to grade it on whether the output is realistic or looks like something that a human would find interesting. When companies like OpenAI or Anthropic are building these models, and especially tuning these models, something similar conceptually is happening, which is that, especially in the fine-tuning step, these models are being trained to output something that is going to be, on average, deemed acceptable or preferable to like kind of a smear of average users that they are training these models on. And so if the model picks something that's very interesting to like a niche group or very interesting to a particular individual, but other people don't like it, then the model's going to be penalized for that versus producing a thing that is like sort of passes the minimum bar for everybody. So it's producing a kind of language equivalent of a blur. I think you can carry over the computer vision techniques and apply it here as well, where maybe I think it might be possible to fine tune a language model to be a little more creative and interesting and sort of poke at the outer boundaries of the like bland grayness. I think in an interface level, this is also kind of a control problem. Another way to think about why the output is gray or output is like blurry is that it's just really hard to pack in all of the context you have inside your head into a prompt. This is like a perennial problem in designing AI products, right? If you ask, for example, a language model for like an interesting story about a cat, in your mind, you have all of the historical context of like all the cat stories that you've encountered and what you like about cats. And like maybe when you say a story, maybe you actually mean like an adventure story, or you actually mean like a mystery novella or something like that. But to a language model, you just said story and cat. And so it's going to sort of regress to the mean of like the most minimum story possible. And an example of an interface solution to a problem like this might be low effort ways for the user to dial in a little bit more information. So maybe a naive way of solving this might be like the language model can ask you back, what do you mean when you say a story? Do you mean mystery? Do you want there to be other animals in it? And I think a level up from that, maybe instead of like having to respond back in language, there is just a bunch of like toggles and levers, and maybe the toggles are automatically generated. So it accounts for like how much action do you want versus like what's the length versus what's the tone, or how much mystery do you want. And then that's another way for the human to communicate, to like narrow the scope of the output such that the model can make it less blurry.
One of the lenses that I really like to look at the progress of interface design is on the bandwidth. Like what's the in and out that a human can do with a computer. One of my favorite books, The Humane Interface by Jeff Raskin, he observes quite elegantly that Hicks law and Fitts law take the log form, kind of similar to Shannon entropy, which suggests you can compare interfaces by like, what's the bandwidth we can output there? And with AI, I mean, I think a lot of people have observed that the chat interface, while very open, doesn't seem like the endpoint. And to me, it seems like a very low bandwidth way to interact with with an AI model. Certainly in terms of input, it's constrained by typing. In terms of what you can do with it, like the affordances, you don't see a lot of affordances naturally. With Notion AI, you've already put a lot of really interesting and helpful buttons, and other affordances in front of the user to like help them understand what to do. But I'm wondering if that lens of thinking about improving the in and out bandwidth resonates with you, and what you might see on the future.
First, that book is on my Amazon wishlist, and it's kind of a big one. It's like a textbook size book. Bandwidth is an interesting way to look at this One idea that I've been toying around with is kind of an alternate way to look at interfaces, which I think is a bit orthogonal, but maybe relevant here. Bandwidth to me is obviously not the only concern. I think it's helpful for like creative tools. I think bandwidth is really key. But a really big QR code can have really high bandwidth, but it's not actually a good human interface. And so there's a second part of term in the equation, which is humans have kind of, to use an ML analogy, humans have inductive biases that mean that certain kinds of information can be more absorbed more easily. And so there's like the raw bandwidth of the information that's coming out of the computer or going into the computer, and then there is how easy it is for the human to make sense of that information that's coming in or going out.
Perceptual bandwidth, maybe.
Yeah, so that's like the effective bandwidth. Another way to think about that effective bandwidth to me is like, how much of what you're trying to understand can you see plainly? Not just see visually, but see in the sense of like, oh, I see what you're saying, like really grok. So like a QR code is very difficult to see through. It's very difficult to grok. Whereas like a video or a diagram is very easy, or like a chart or a data table is really easy. And so I think good interfaces make things kind of plain and self-evident, while also maximizing the information that you're communicating per pixel or per ink printed on the page. Anytime you're engaging in some kind of a knowledge work task, there's a lot of pieces you have to assemble. Like before you can actually sit down and write that report or write an essay or like compile an interview prep list or whatever, you have to put the pieces on the table, and that takes a lot of work. But that is, you first have to be able to see all of the pieces in play before you can start writing. And so one thing that we've thought about and prototyped around is how can AI help you kind of co-locate all of the information that you need to do something before you actually do it. At which point something like the writer that we already have can be really handy. There's also a level at which you can talk about this in the like notation or representation or diagram level.
Can you quickly define what you mean by notation?
Another word for this is like representation. My favorite example of
Abstraction,
notation is like a data table. A data table is a way to kind of symbolically represent a bunch of data points in a way that makes it easy to see certain trends or understand certain kinds of information. A part of the reason it's better is because it sort of more naturally reflects the structure of the information. A notation that's very different is a spectrogram. A spectrogram, for those who are not familiar, is a way to represent sound or anything with kind of frequency over time. So normally if you have a song, if you go on like SoundCloud, they'll show you an amplitude chart where you can see like when a song is loud and when a song is soft. And that's a way of looking at sound as a single vibration that happens over time, which is kind of like what sound waves are intuitively. But there's another way to notate or describe or represent the sound, which is you look at all of the different frequencies that are present in that music and like make one column for each frequency or one row for each frequency, and then kind of mark where that frequency happens. So if you squint, the Western music notation with the 5 lines in the staff is kind of like it, where you have different notes, and then a note appears anytime you like press that key. And if you look at a spectrogram, it's really easy to tell when there are certain repeating spans, when there are measures, when there are breaks, when the like bass comes back, or the like the human voice kind of range of sound is really strong versus fading out. And so it's a different way of looking at the same information. Maybe in a raw sense, like the waveform amplitude plot over time and the spectrogram has the same bandwidth, because you can imagine resizing those images such that they communicate this like same number of bits of information about the sound. But depending on what kinds of question you're trying to answer about the track, one view versus the other might be better fit for that, for how the human brain processes that visual information. And
bandwidth, perceptual bandwidth depends on the human's context and their training as well. If you've never used Figma before, it's going to be a very low bandwidth interface for you. And if you're a trained musician, Western musical notation is going to be extremely high bandwidth. If you're not a trained musician, it's not much better than like a collapsed spectrogram.
Yeah. One constant battle in designing all these interfaces is the like classic intuition versus power Pareto frontier, right? You can make some progress on that by just borrowing all of the metaphors and intuitions that humans in general have about the world, like the idea of like a scale where forward in time means right or forward in time means left. It's like a very intuitive idea that like Western music notation borrows and spectrograms borrow. But there are obviously other metaphors that are harder. Oh, you know what I learned recently that's kind of related to this? It's really interesting. The arrow symbol, the like line with a triangle at the end, the arrow symbol was apparently not invented until the 1800s, which is mind-blowing to me. It's like
That's cool.
It's kind of everywhere. It's on the street signs. It's in like basically all the whiteboards in the office that I'm currently in, probably. It's mind-blowing to me that such a symbol and universal notation had to be invented so recently and like much closer to the invention of like the typewriter than like the written language. And so there's, I guess, the insight from that is that even though it seems so obvious now because we've been with that notation for so long, it actually wasn't, and it had to be kind of invented and then presumably like sold to convince people to use this notation. And then after a while, all of us grow up with it, and now it's obvious, but it wasn't always.
Another similar thing I like is that I think the equation, equating higher pitches in music with higher, like physically higher, like that metaphor, that's a really interesting one to me. I don't think there's no reason why that should be the case. Like higher frequency means the adjective we use is higher elevation.
Right. Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's interesting. It's hard. It's almost hard to escape that mindset because the word that we use to describe it is high. And so you're like, oh, it's a high pitch. Obviously, it's going to be like higher up on the page. One other example that comes to mind is I play piano. And when I first learned piano, I was a wee little kid. And the way that, because I had trouble reading Western music notation, the way that my teacher helped me read the notes is she would color them. And so like C would be red and D would be orange. And it's like there are 7 sort of white keys on the piano, and they would correspond to the 7 colors of the rainbow, which also wasn't always the case. People thought there were 3 colors of the rainbow at some point. And so even still, when I play the piano, I mentally associate C with like yellow or red or whatever it was. And you can imagine, because there's this like octave scale where the same 7 notes repeat every 8 intervals, you can imagine a color wheel, and you could almost make the argument that that's actually a more intuitive way to look at pitches, is because there are these octaves and intervals. Maybe you should actually notate it with something that's cyclic instead of like height. And that would probably give you a lot of interesting insight about chords and harmonies in a way that the Western music notation up is higher wouldn't.
I think this is just a really interesting space to play with, because I think a lot of good interface design is trying to recognize these ephemeral truths. Like maybe they're objective, but shared by not everybody, and then concretize them, put them into a mechanism. And if we get it close enough, that can be learned, and that can become the new scaffolding on which we build like our next set of interfaces.
Right.
Like to describe it a different way, like you, when it comes to musical notation or musical, just thinking about the keys, it sounds like you have a learned synesthesia. Some people have natural synesthesia that may or may not line up. And then many people to some degree may have no synesthesia when it comes to color in music. Right. But if you had all of those data points and you were able to find some pattern in there that's strong enough, and then you all of a sudden switched or proposed a new notation that had a really strong synesthetic background or foundation, maybe that would be a new container for like the next wave of interfaces.
Yeah, definitely. I think inventing all these different other representations of seeing the thing often come from deep scientific insight about the thing that it represents. So spectrograms, or to some level, the like Western music notations where there are cycles and intervals, inventing those, maybe some of these are more organically involved, but if you were to invent them from first principles, it would require some understanding of what sound is and the fact that there are these harmonies and intervals. And to bring it back to AI and language and interfaces, one of the more kind of fundamental reasons for my excitement about doing interface work on top of language models is that language models give us a kind of like industrial scale machine to like mine for scientific understanding of language in a very different way than how linguistics is traditionally operated, which is, I think, a lot more anthropological. Language models, if you begin to like inspect how they work, reveal as a basic example of something they reveal is like relationship between how different languages say the same thing, right? If you train a multilingual model, there's going to be some representation in the model's internal latent space that unifies how different languages say the same thing. And maybe that teaches us something, gives us some insight about translation or about different languages that helps us invent some new way of writing documents. All of this is very abstract, but I think it's like early in the field, and language models are very new. And so language models as like an industrial-sized mining machine for insights about language, I think is really exciting.
Thanks, Linus, for your time. We really enjoyed talking with you today. Once again, congrats on your Golden Kitty Award. Well deserved. And we're excited to see some of the stuff that you guys have been talking through, both in the abstract and literal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for the Golden Kitty Award and just an hour to like nerd over everything we talked about.